What were the burial rituals and customs for ancient Egyptians? Mummification, burial ceremonies, customs and rituals, and burial masks. Mummification was not something that a lot of ancient Egyptians were able to have done, because it was quite costly and very elaborate to do. The ancient Egyptians believed that by preserving the body as much as possible, that this would allow the deceased individual to be able to live again in the afterlife. With mummification, the dead were first embalmed, so the body was washed with a special wine and then rinsed with water for purification purposes. An embalmer would then remove internal organs, such as the lungs, intestines, stomach, and liver, and then wash them before putting them in a natural salt for them to dry out. As for the brain, an embalmer used a long metal hook to go up into the nasal cavity to shake the deceased brains around, where it could then be pulled out through the nostrils. The heart was never removed because it was believed that the deceased would need it in the afterlife. Embalmers would then put natural salt into the deceased body to dry it out and then leave it alone for 40 days, after which the body was cleansed again and oiled. The lungs, intestines, stomach, and liver were wrapped in linen strips and placed in canopic jars. The deceased body was then wrapped in strips of linen in a certain order, and amulets were placed between layers of linen for the deceased's safe journey into the afterlife. Spells were spoken by priests from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, added to scrolls, and placed between the deceased's hands. Osiris, the god of the underworld, was painted onto a full-length cloth that was wrapped around the body, and then a plain cloth was put over that with linen strips attached. Very elaborate burial ceremonies were performed for the pharaohs and other elite who could afford it. The mummy was then taken to its final resting place with family, friends, priests, and the deceased's precious items in tow. Numerous rites, rituals, and prayers were performed over many days, and all valuables of the deceased were placed inside the tomb, including food and water, for the deceased to take with them on their journey into the afterlife. A painted board was placed on top of the mummy before it was lowered into 2 sets of coffins. The coffins were then placed into a stone sarcophagus. It was left to Osiris to judge whether the person was worthy enough to be reborn into the afterlife. Family, friends, and priests would then exit the tomb, and it was then sealed shut. Burial masks were vital because ancient Egyptians believed that the deceased spirit was able to locate and recognize his or her body in the afterlife based on the face on the deceased person's burial mask. Burial mask contains inscriptions and spells for protecting the deceased's spirit. The pharaoh's burial masks were made out of gold, as gold was thought to have magical powers and keep evil spirits away. The masks were encrusted with many jewels as well. Egyptian burial masks were meant to flatter the deceased person, making them as handsome or beautiful as possible, even if they were not that way when they were alive. Could this be why the ancient Egyptians were thought to be quite vain, because they valued beauty to such a large extent? From ancient Egyptian architecture, language, writing, religion, mummification, burial ceremonies, customs, rituals, and burial masks, the Egyptians of old were a fascinating, unique, and very powerful civilization that dominated the land for over 3,000 years. Their religion was kept at the forefront of their society and never forgotten. Over thousands of years, Western civilization has continued to learn and grow, thanks in part to the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians of old strove hard to ensure that Egypt would always stay in the hearts and minds of everyone possible, leaving an indelible mark upon the world for all eternity.